They looked to the sky not for wonder, but for warning. When a comet streaked across the stars, or the moon vanished into darkness, kingdoms trembled. Kings consulted astrologers. Priests called for prayer. Entire villages fell into panic. 2. The medieval mind. These were no random events, they were omens. Signals of God's wrath, or the devil's arrival. But why did a simple shadow in the sky provoke terror? And how did this fear shape history, power, and belief? This is the story of how the heavens once ruled the earth through fear in medieval Europe. The sky was more than a collection of stars, and planets. It was the divine blueprint of all creation. To people of the time, the heavens revealed God's will, mapped the structure of the universe, and set the rhythm for life on earth. Nothing in the sky was random. Everything had meaning. Medieval cosmology was built on the Ptolemaic model inherited from ancient Greece but adapted to fit Christian theology. Earth stood immobile at the center of the universe, surrounded by concentric spheres carrying the moon, sun, planets, and stars. Beyond these spheres lay the empyrean heaven itself, where angels and God resided. This geocentric vision wasn't just scientific theory, it was moral architecture. Higher meant holier. The more distant from Earth, the closer to perfection. The cosmos was ordered, structured, and deliberate, just as God intended. This belief in cosmic hierarchy wasn't abstract. It shaped everything from medieval architecture to political power. Cathedrals were designed to reflect heavenly order. Kings ruled by divine right, seen as positioned below angels but above commoners in the same layered structure that governed the stars. To question the structure of the heavens was to question God's authority, the Church's doctrine, and the foundation of society itself. Astrology, too, played a prominent role. Though often mistrusted by clergy, it was deeply woven into medical, agricultural, and political life. Learned men consulted planetary alignments before making decisions. Physicians relied on the stars to determine when to bleed a patient or administer herbs. Crops were planted according to lunar cycles. Royal courts hired astrologers, not as entertainers, but as advisors. Even popes sought their counsel during times of crisis. Christian doctrine merged with these cosmic ideas in powerful ways. The book of Genesis described the stars as signs and seasons, while the Gospels spoke of celestial events accompanying Christ's birth and death. The sky was filled with spiritual messages. Eclipses, comets, and meteors weren't seen as natural, they were warnings or judgments. The firmament above wasn't silent, it was speaking. But this confidence in cosmic meaning came with a dangerous edge. When the heavens behaved unexpectedly, when a blood moon rose, or a comet tore through the night, sky people panicked. If the sky was God's canvas, any disruption on it had to mean something was wrong. And in a world built on divine order, disorder in the heavens triggered fear on earth. This was not ignorance in the modern sense. It was perceived knowledge grounded in the best understanding available at the time. The medieval mind wasn't irrational. It was interpreting the world through a different lens, one that fused theology, philosophy, and celestial observation into a single, unified worldview. The sky wasn't distant, it was watching, it was judging, and it held the fate of nations. A sudden shadow crawled across the sun. The air turned cold. Birds fell silent. Livestock panicked. For a medieval observer, this wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. A solar eclipse wasn't a marvel, it was a rupture. An interruption in what was supposed to be the perfect order of the heavens. And in a world where divine structure explained everything from weather to war, That disruption meant only one thing: something terrible was coming. The medieval universe was built on the belief that the cosmos was stable, harmonious, and divinely maintained. Comets, meteors, eclipses, these weren't part of the plan. Their sudden appearance meant the heavens were disturbed. And if the sky, God's domain, had been shaken, then Earth was next. In the year 1133, chroniclers across Europe recorded a solar eclipse that plunged England into darkness. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in this year King Henry went oversea at Lammas, and soon after, the moon was eclipsed on the eve of August 2nd, from before evening until nearly day. Within months, King Henry I of England died unexpectedly. For many, the eclipse was the warning, and the king's death the fulfillment of the sign. The event wasn't seen as coincidence. It was cause and consequence. Comets, too, were feared as omens. Their appearance was almost always interpreted as a prelude to disaster. In 1006, a brilliant comet appeared across the skies of Europe, the Middle East, and China. It was so bright it reportedly cast shadows at night. European monks and Arabic astronomers alike recorded it in awe and anxiety. To some, it heralded the rise of new rulers. To others, the outbreak of war or plague. The comet's appearance was followed in Europe by famine and social unrest. The cause-effect link, while unfounded scientifically, felt real to people at the time. One of the most famous examples came in 1456, when what we now know as Halley's Comet blazed across the sky. Pope Calixtus III was so disturbed by it coming as it did during the Ottoman siege of Belgrade that he ordered prayers and exorcisms to drive away its evil. Church bells were rung across Europe to chase the comet, while special masses were held to ward off divine punishment. The comet itself became a symbol of dread tied directly to the threat of Islamic invasion and Christian defeat. Even lunar eclipses, which posed no danger and were entirely predictable, were read as messages. In 1230, a red-hued eclipse was seen. In Germany, chroniclers described it as blood washing over the moon, indeedly interpreted as a warning of coming violence. And indeed, the following months saw civil unrest and harsh winters that devastated harvests. These reactions weren't random panic. They were rooted in a consistent worldview, one in which the heavens mirrored the divine will. If a king was to die, a war to erupt, or a plague to sweep through a town, the sky would first signal it. The problem was not the event itself, but the uncertainty. The sudden appearance of a comet or the blackening of the sun shattered the illusion of control, reminding rulers and peasants alike that they lived under a higher power, one that rarely explained itself. In a time before modern astronomy, the sky's unpredictability represented something far more dangerous than ignorance. It represented divine chaos, and in the eyes of medieval people, that was the most terrifying sign of all. In the spring of 1066, an uninvited guest appeared in the English sky. A bright, fiery streak tore across the heavens visible for days. To modern astronomy, it was Halley's Comet on one of its 76-year cycles. But to the people of 11th century England, it was no celestial routine. It was a sign, and for many, it meant doom. The timing couldn't have been more unsettling. Just weeks earlier, King Edward the Confessor had died without a clear heir. The English throne passed swiftly to Harold Godwinson, a powerful noble with deep political ties, but a contested claim. Across the Channel, Duke William of Normandy saw opportunity and betrayal. William insisted that Harold had once sworn an oath to support his own claim to the throne. When news of Harold's coronation reached Normandy, William began preparations for invasion. And then, the sky lit up. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the most respected records of the time, noted the appearance of the comet in ominous terms. In this year came a sign in the heavens, such a long-haired star as no man had seen before. Another chronicler, the Norman monk William of Gemidgis, called it a marvelous star and interpreted it as a divine warning to Harold. For many observers, monks, nobles, commoners, the connection was clear. A king had taken the throne under questionable circumstances, and God had responded. The comet became a narrative tool. In England, some saw it as a symbol of Harold's rising star, but more often, it was cast as an omen of his downfall. In Normandy, it served as a celestial endorsement of William's invasion. Chroniclers didn't just describe the comet, they used it. It gave moral weight to political claims, transforming a military campaign into a righteous correction of divine order. When the Battle of Hastings unfolded later that year, on October 14th, it did so under the long shadow of that bright celestial warning. Harold was killed, struck in the eye by an arrow, according to legend, and William emerged victorious. Within months, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The conquest was brutal, the transitions, but in the minds of many, the outcome had been written in the sky months before. The Bayeux Tapestry, an embroidered visual record, likely commissioned by Norman elites, captures this moment vividly. Near the panel showing Harold's coronation, the comet blazes above a group of terrified onlookers. The Latin inscription reads, Isti mirant, stella. These men marvel at the star. The message was deliberate. Harold's reign was not legitimate, and the heavens had warned of his fall. In an age where omens and politics were intertwined, the 1066 comet wasn't just observed, it was interpreted, repurposed, and recorded as part of a larger divine narrative. It helped justify war, explain loss, and frame conquest as fulfillment of celestial prophecy. The skies had spoken, and England would never be the same. On the morning of May 1st, 1185, darkness fell over parts of England. The sky, clear, just. Moments before, dimmed as the moon silently passed in front of the sun. The solar eclipse cast an unnatural shadow across towns and fields. For modern eyes, it might have been a wonder, but in the 12th century, it was a warning. Eyewitnesses recorded birds falling quiet, stars emerging in daylight, and villagers dropping to their knees in panic. It wasn't seen as a natural phenomenon, it was seen as judgment to a medieval audience. A solar eclipse wasn't just unexpected. It was incomprehensible. The sky, believed to reflect divine order, had turned against them. Chroniclers didn't just describe eclipses, they interpreted them. Gervase of Canterbury, a monk and historian, called the 1185 eclipse a horrible and fearful sign. That same year, a powerful earthquake struck the region, and fires devastated parts of York. To Gervase and his contemporaries, the sequence confirmed what they already feared. God was angry. Biblical prophecy gave eclipses added weight. In the book of Joel, the warning is clear. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. These words were not treated as metaphor. They were a lens through which the faithful read the sky. When the sun vanished or the moon glowed red during a lunar eclipse, many believed it marked the beginning of the end, either personal, political, or apocalyptic. The fear wasn't limited to monks or scholars. Royal courts took eclipses seriously. In 1133, a total solar eclipse occurred just as King Henry I was crossing the Channel. The king died shortly afterward. Across England, the eclipse was remembered not for its astronomy, but for its consequence. It became part of the folklore surrounding the king's final days, an omen that power had shifted and a storm was coming. Civil war soon erupted, the period known as the Anarchy, even in Byzantium. Centuries earlier, solar eclipses triggered mass anxiety. In 968, when one such eclipse covered Constantinople, people flooded churches, ringing bells and lighting candles. In broad daylight, priests organized urgent processions, and citizens fasted, hoping to reverse whatever sin had brought about the darkness. The Church did not always oppose these interpretations. While some theologians discouraged superstition, many embraced eclipses. As tools of repentance, preachers used them to call for moral reform, linking the sudden darkness to human corruption. It was a tactic that resonated with a population already living with famine, disease, and violence. When the sky blackened, it only confirmed their fear. Humanity was being punished. No one could predict when the next eclipse would come, and that uncertainty only deepened the terror. The day the sun disappeared was never just about astronomy. It was about helplessness in the face of cosmic power. In a world where life was already uncertain, a vanishing sun was more than strange. It was a sign that the end might already be unfolding. In medieval courts, stars weren't just symbols, they were strategy. Astrology wasn't entertainment, it was statecraft. Kings and emperors across Europe and the Islamic world relied on astrologers not as mystics, but as advisors. Celestial signs were read like reports, and the stakes were real war, succession, even survival. In the 14th century, Charles V of France employed the astrologer Thomas of Pizan, father of Christine de Pizan, one of Europe's first female historians. Charles consulted him regularly, not just on personal health, but on matters of diplomacy and internal unrest. Far from being marginal figures, court astrologers held considerable influence, shaping policies under the veil of divine alignment. The tension between religion and astrology, however, was never fully settled. Church doctrine warned against placing too much faith in the stars. The Council of Trent and earlier councils condemned forms of divination. Yet many clergy, especially high-ranking ones, relied on astrological guidance in practice, even as they denounced it in sermons. Popes themselves were no exception. Pope Sixtus IV consulted astrologers before major decisions. Pope Julius II reportedly postponed his coronation based on a troubling reading of planetary movements. Despite official opposition, astrology remained embedded in church politics. The inconsistency wasn't lost on critics, but it was rarely punished. When celestial fear served church authority, theological resistance faded. Preachers used rare sky events as moral leverage. An eclipse, a comet, or a blood moon gave them a perfect opportunity to demand repentance. In 1406, a solar eclipse over England sparked widespread panic. Sermons across the country declared it a punishment for sin. Flagellant movements groups who publicly whipped themselves to atone for humanity's wrongdoings saw a surge. Religious fear translated into obedience, and obedience reinforced power. But not everyone who interpreted the sky did so with conviction. The blurred lines between knowledge and manipulation made space for fraud. Some self-proclaimed seers exploited public ignorance, selling prophecies, talismans, or protection rituals to terrified clients. In cities like Florence and Cologne, astrologers advertised predictions of plague, political upheaval, or personal misfortune often for a fee. With little scientific grounding, and no accountability. Some of these figures thrived on chaos. This tension between genuine observation, religious authority, and opportunistic deception defined the medieval approach to the heavens. Astrology was both a science in formation and a tool for control. It appealed to rulers who sought legitimacy, clerics who needed moral leverage, and opportunists who knew how to profit from fear. By the late Middle Ages, the contradictions grew sharper. Universities like Bologna and Paris taught astrology as part of the medical curriculum, while church leaders condemned it from the pulpit. The sky had become a battleground, not just of gods and demons, but of power, knowledge, and belief. And in the shadows of every comet and eclipse, someone stood ready to shape the story for their own advantage. In March 1345, astrologers across Europe took notice. A rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars formed under the sign of Aquarius. To many, this was not simply a celestial alignment, it was a cosmic warning. Three of the most influential planets in medieval astrology, gathered in a house associated with air and water, were seen as a signal of corruption in the atmosphere. When plague swept through Europe just 2 years later, killing tens of millions, the connection seemed obvious. The Black Death, what medieval chroniclers called the Great Mortality, began its devastation in 1347. But by then, the groundwork for fear had already been laid in the skies. In Paris, physicians commissioned by King Philip VI published the Compendium Epidemia, attributing the plague to the 1345 planetary alignment. According to their report, the conjunction had corrupted the air, making it toxic and deadly. Miasma theory, widely accepted at the time, suggested that foul air, not germs, was the cause of disease, and the heavens, they believed, had poisoned the wind. But it wasn't just planets that drew suspicion. In 1347, before the plague reached Europe, a bright comet was reported in the night sky. Chroniclers from Italy, the Low Countries, and Bohemia mentioned it, describing it as a flaming sword or a dragon's tail. The symbolism was clear. Comets, long feared as omens of catastrophe, were interpreted as signals of divine wrath. As bodies piled up in the streets of Florence, London, and Avignon, few doubted that the heavens had turned against humanity. The connection between the sky and the plague wasn't merely theoretical. It shaped how cities responded. In many towns, bells were rung to ward off celestial influence. Processions were held to beg for mercy. In some areas, mass hysteria took hold. The infamous flagellant movements, bands of penitents who marched from town to town, whipping themselves, gained thousands of followers, believing the plague was God's punishment for sin. The comet and the alignment were not just events, they were proof. By 1350, the death toll had reached staggering levels. Estimates suggest that Europe lost between 30 to 50% of its population. Entire villages were abandoned. Fields went unharvested. Trade routes collapsed. And in the absence of understanding, fear ruled. The skies, long revered as a source of divine order, were now viewed as agents of chaos. Even decades later, when the immediate crisis had passed, references to the 1345 conjunction persisted in medical texts and religious sermons. The belief that the plague had been foretold in the stars became part of the historical memory, solidifying the role of astrology and celestial interpretation in how people explained disaster. This was more than superstition. It was an attempt to assign cause in a time of unimaginable suffering. In a world with no concept of bacteria or contagion, the heavens offered both a diagnosis and a scapegoat. The fear wasn't abstracted, drove real decisions, justified public rituals, and reshaped the relationship between people, power, and the sky. In medieval Christian thought, the sky was not just a realm of stars and angels, it was a mirror of human morality. Disasters on earth, whether famine, plague, or war, were believed to reflect sin. When the heavens shifted, when eclipses darkened the sun, or comets scorched across the sky, those changes were read as messages, warnings, punishments. The Bible itself set the precedent. In the book of Jeremiah, I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord. And in the Gospels, Jesus warns of signs in the heavens preceding judgment. There shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars. These passages were not treated as metaphor, they were prophecy. A comet wasn't just a light in the sky, it was divine handwriting. Preachers reinforced this worldview with urgency. John of Capistrano, a 15th century Franciscan friar, famously warned during a sermon, "The sins of the people have reached the stars, and the stars themselves now cry out against us." He was not alone. Clergy across Europe drew direct connections between social corruption, usury, adultery, heresy, and cosmic response. When eclipses occurred, pulpits thundered with calls to repent. This theology served a function. It made suffering comprehensible. If God controlled the cosmos, and if suffering followed sin, then disaster had meaning. In this logic, the chaos of plague or crop failure was not random, it was correction. Fear of divine wrath kept communities morally restrained and socially obedient. It also reinforced the authority of the Church, which claimed exclusive access to the proper interpretation of these signs. In 1356, following another series of disasters, the theologian Jean de Roquetelade preached that fire from heaven and poison in the air would strike sinful cities. His sermons sparked widespread panic and public acts of penance. That same year, an earthquake struck Basel, Switzerland. Churches were filled overnight. People fasted, confessed, and prepared for the end. The theological framework left little room for doubt. If the sky darkened or burned, it was not nature, it was judgment. And repentance was the only defense. In a world without modern science, this belief system gave structure to fear, but it also became a tool. Guilt could be shaped, fear could be guided, and morality, real or imposed, was policed not just by men, but by the sky itself. In the 13th century, English philosopher Roger Bacon studied the skies not to interpret divine messages, but to understand physical causes. He argued that eclipses followed natural cycles and that comets were not signs of God's wrath, but atmospheric phenomena, possibly light reflecting off vapors in the upper air. His views, rooted in observation and logic, placed him at odds with a world still gripped by theology. Bacon was eventually imprisoned by church authorities. His crime wasn't heresy in doctrine, but heresy in method. He had dared to separate natural events from divine intent. He wasn't alone. Across the Islamic world, centuries earlier, scholars like al-Battani, al-Zarqali, and Ibn al-Haytham had already mapped planetary motion with precision. They calculated eclipse patterns, revised Ptolemaic models, and rejected superstition in favor of mathematics. Their works were translated into Latin and slowly filtered into European universities. But the shift was neither fast nor smooth. Knowledge alone wasn't enough to dismantle belief. By the 12th century, European scholars at centers like Toledo and Palermo had access to these Arabic texts. Gerbert of Aurillac, later Pope Sylvester II, had studied Islamic astronomy and introduced the astrolabe to Europe. Still, he was rumored to have made a pact with the devil. Rational knowledge, especially when it challenged religious interpretation, was often treated with suspicion or outright hostility. The resistance was cultural as much as theological. If comets were stripped of their moral meaning, if eclipses were just shadows cast by celestial mechanics, then the Church lost one of its most persuasive tools, the fear of cosmic punishment, and rulers lost a language of authority that had legitimized wars, coronations, and reforms. Understanding the sky meant removing mystery and, with it, control, even as late as the 15th century. Astronomers like Regiomontanus and Georg von Feuerbach worked under the shadow of this tension. They advanced the predictive accuracy of lunar and solar eclipses, but their findings circulated mainly among scholars. Public sermons still warned of sin when the moon turned red or a comet appeared over a battlefield. The old world view didn't collapse in a single moment. It eroded slowly, unevenly. Each observation, each corrected chart, each translated manuscript was a step toward rationality, but also an act of defiance. Science had begun to speak. But for centuries, fear still spoke louder. In 1456, Halley's comet returned to the skies over Europe. It was brilliant, unmistakable, and deeply unsettling. Just months earlier, the Ottoman Empire had launched a massive siege on the Christian stronghold of Belgrade. Pope Calixtus III issued a papal bull declaring the comet a warning from heaven. Bells were ordered to ring across Christendom. Special prayers were prescribed to ward off its influence. It was not just an astronomical event. It was framed as a threat, and threats demanded response. In this atmosphere of dread, belief often turned violent. Across Europe, comets and eclipses were linked to misfortune, failed harvests, sudden plagues, the outbreak of war. But without clear explanations, people looked for human causes. Someone had to be responsible. By the early 16th century, witch trials intensified across German-speaking territories, parts of France, and Switzerland. Accusations often surged in the wake of unexplained disasters. In 1587, a comet appeared over Central Europe. Within a year, the town of Ellwangen launched one of its most brutal witch hunts. 400 people were arrested, tortured, and many executed. Testimonies extracted under duress described women calling down storms, spoiling crops, or consorting with demons. None of it required proof. The sky had already signaled guilt. These waves of persecution weren't random. They were structured responses to fear. Manuals, like the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, gave ecclesiastical backing to the idea that witches could influence nature. According to Kramer, their pacts with the devil enabled them to manipulate the elements, drought, disease, even eclipses. Under this logic, a comet wasn't just a sign of divine punishment. It was a symptom of hidden corruption on earth. Heresy, too, came under renewed suspicion. During the Reformation, both Protestant and Catholic factions interpreted celestial events as divine endorsement or condemnation of their rivals. A blood moon in 1533 was said to predict the downfall of the Catholic Church. A comet in 1577 was used by Catholic authorities to denounce Protestant unrest in the Holy Roman Empire. Belief systems weaponized the sky, and each faction claimed the heavens as their witness. What followed was not spiritual awakening but institutionalized paranoia. Women, minorities, and dissidents became targets. The The fear triggered by celestial events was redirected toward the most vulnerable. The sky may have sparked fear, but it was human systems that inflicted the pain. These episodes weren't relics of some distant past. They were the result of real decisions, fueled by anxiety and sanctioned by belief. When people looked up and didn't understand what they saw, they turned on each other, and history bore the cost. By the late 15th century, Europe was shifting. The printing press had begun to spread ideas with a speed never seen before. Universities expanded. Classical texts, once confined to monastic libraries, were retranslated, debated, and dissected. Scientific methods gained traction. Astronomers, like Nicolaus Copernicus, questioned the geocentric model itself, laying the groundwork for a new way of seeing the heavens not as a divine message board, but as a system governed by natural laws. Yet the fear didn't disappear. In 1577, a bright comet blazed across the European sky. Despite decades of growing astronomical literacy, it sparked widespread panic. Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe attempted to measure its distance, proving it lay beyond the moon and refuting centuries of belief that comets were atmospheric. His observations were precise, revolutionary, and largely ignored by the general public. For many, it was still a sign of war, death, or divine anger. Even among scholars, superstition lingered. Johannes Kepler, a key figure in the scientific revolution, calculated planetary motion with stunning accuracy. Yet he, too, believed that celestial alignments could influence human affairs. Astrology retained its grip not because it stood up to scrutiny, but because it offered meaning in uncertain times. By the 17th century, Galileo Galilei turned his telescope to the sky. He discovered moons orbiting Jupiter, craters on the moon, and phases of Venusal, evidence that the heavens were not immutable, not perfect, and not arranged solely around Earth. His findings were met with condemnation. In 1633, the Inquisition forced him to recant. The idea that the universe didn't revolve around humanity remained too dangerous for those invested in religious and political order. Over time, fear gave way to curiosity. Comets were mapped, eclipses predicted, and planetary orbits modeled with precision. But the cultural residue remained. In 1910, as Halley's Comet approached Earth again, newspapers reported widespread anxiety. Some feared it would poison the atmosphere. Others bought comet pills to protect themselves. This, after Newton, after Darwin, after the birth of modern science. Even today, rare sky events still provoke awe, anxiety, and speculation. Social media fills with predictions during lunar eclipses or meteor showers. Apocalyptic theories resurface with every blood moon. The superstition is quieter now, often disguised as curiosity or conspiracy, but it hasn't vanished. The medieval fear may have faded, but it left a mark. For thousands of years, the sky was not a place of exploration. It was a source of judgment. And somewhere beneath the surface, that memory still lingers.